Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Gran Turismo 7. It's time for my follow-up video to my top 10 favourite cars of 2024 with my top 5 worst cars of 2024. Now I can't stress this enough, this is going to be my personal list. You may like some of these cars or you may agree with me. If you don't, feel free to just put your top 5 down in the comments below. Now I've used a bunch of different factors to determine what has been the worst and most disappointing cars of this year. Now of course, first of all, it must be a car that has been released post-launch in 2024 from January until December of this year. So of course, straight away, cars that were in-game on launch or post-launch 22 or 23 will not be included on this list. Of course, the main first factor of this is going to be the fun factor of the car. Now again, if you're not having fun with a car, that kind of says a lot about it. Next up is if the car is useless. This is kind of a problem with GT7 itself, where a lot of cars really don't have any use. But again, if a car's come out this year and doesn't have anywhere to be used, then it kind of guarantees it to be on this list. Next up is longevity, so the amount of mileage you're putting on it and the amount of time spent. And finally is upgrades. Some cars may be bad upon their launch, however, if you can get them upgraded, it can change the car entirely. So things like engine swaps and tuning parts. So let's kick the list off then with my dishonourable mentions. These are cars that didn't quite make it on my top 5 worst list for one reason or another. And to begin, I have the Suzuki Jimny XC. Whilst this might not be the most desirable car, it was actually pretty usable and has been a decent grinding car for me. However, the main reason this one creeps on the list so late is because the Sierra got released in the last content update of 2024, making the XC almost irrelevant, as the Sierra is pretty much bigger and better in every single way and only costs 2,000 credits more. It's also a much better variant to go ahead and tune. It has the better engine swap of the two, and again, it just makes the XC completely irrelevant in game now. Whilst the XC may have been good for a bit of AFK custom race grinding on the snow circuits, apart from that, there's no other real reason to go ahead and actually set this car up or really spend any time with it. Yes, it looks pretty cool with its K-car charm, but apart from that, the Sierra is just all around a better variant, kind of dooming the XC onto this list at the last possible moment. So if the Sierra wasn't released, I don't think the XCK variant of the Jimny would have been on this list. Let's move on to dishonourable mention number 2 then. This for me is one of the biggest disappointments of the year, the Renault 4. Now I love myself a quirky car in GT7 and I think the detail on this one is absolutely superb. Unfortunately though, it's been almost forgotten by Polyphony. Apart from a couple of special events upon its release, it was entirely forgotten by them. It does have some quirky features like the shifter coming out the dashboard, but unfortunately the lack of any post-launch engine swap really hurt this car, meaning that it doesn't really find itself a use in game. Unlike other little classics like the Abarth, which have the K20 engine swap, the Renault 4 didn't get the same treatment, and unfortunately is probably one of those cars that's kind of been made irrelevant now. And next up we have the Bulgari VGT. Now this is a bit of a strange one, considering it was kind of released in 2023 on a, I guess, special basis, and then fully released in 2024. Now first of all, I won't deny this is perhaps the easiest car to set up for the 700pp Le Mans grind. However, going back to its early access in December of 2023, you may remember this thing was essentially a $4,000 DLC accompanied by the 10th anniversary Gran Turismo watch, meaning it was available in game for free to pretty much all of 0.01% of Gran Turismo players, with the rest of the world having to wait another month for this thing to actually be released in game. So basically its reputation was tarnished before it even got in game, and whilst it did kind of redeem itself being the easiest grinding car to set up in the entirety of GT7 and being a very good one, I do feel the fact that it was accompanied by a $4,000 watch for early access really hurt it, and this was a last minute decision by Polyphony as well. So I guess it's a 23/24 car. Let's get into the top 5 then, beginning with number 5, the Volvo V40 T5 R design from 2013. This car sneaks into the list for a very good reason, because it's one of only 2 Volvos in game, and of course the other Volvo being the 240 SE, one of the most loved Volvos of all time. That big old Swedish tank estate really has a lot of personality going for it, and now includes a 1200 brake horsepower engine swap to make it a massive drift missile. Now, of course, when it comes to the V40, it's not necessarily a bad car, it just feels rather uninspiring. When you've got something as iconic as the 240 SE, of course, that big tank-like estate coming to the game, and this releasing alongside it, of course, it's always going to be in its shadow. Now, again, it isn't necessarily a bad car. You can customize it decently, you can make some decent touring car builds with it, but apart from that, it just feels, again, very uninspiring and really not that fun to drive. So of course, on one hand, this is one of two Volvos in game, which kind of gives it a special place, and it doesn't really look like we're going to get many other Volvos arrive in game, if any. However, again, as mentioned, when we look at the lineup of Volvo cars across the years, I really don't think the V40 would have been one that players were really crying out for, unlike the 240 SE, which is brimming with personality. Now, the car does have some decent points. When it's got the fine tuning going on, it can handle most tracks in game pretty well, and it does have decent performance. It also sounds absolutely fantastic, I cannot deny the car that, but it does overall feel like a very forgettable car this year, and again, thanks to that 240 SE, you may have even forgot it got added. Moving on to number 4, the Audi TT Coupe from 2009. This was a car when I first saw it was getting released to GT7 that I felt didn't really need to be added. There wasn't many years between the earliest model TT and the latest model TT that we had in game, and this one was kind of just slap straight bang in the middle. Now, I will admit there's a bit of personal bias here where I think this generation of TT is perhaps the ugliest of all the generations. It just seems like an over bloated version of the original, and it doesn't have that pretty nice looking aggressive styling of the more modern counterpart that we already have in game. And again, when it comes to the price, it's the exact same, where it's just slapped in the middle in terms of price and performance, and for me it just doesn't feature the charm of the TT Coupe that we already have from 2003, or of course the aggressive styling of the TTS that we have from 2014, which I just think looks like a much better car than the middle ground variant. Now, putting my personal bias aside, I did give this car a chance, especially for its performance, when I noticed it did have the kind of DTM kit to go alongside it, but unfortunately the lack of engine swap meant that it just fell completely flat, considering its default performance really isn't that good. However, I will admit, when it comes to upgrades, this has perhaps been one of the better models of the year for different types of builds, different body kits, and of course that ridiculous rear DTM wing, which I think looks absolutely incredible. So you can basically transform this car into something else completely, but unfortunately you're going to be stuck with a road engine, poor fuel efficiency, and overall just not that good of performance. Had this car got an engine swap, it would have not been on this list, and honestly, that is me who has a bias towards this car just being the ugliest generation of TT. I feel like this one deserved better. However, it has been a while since this car launched in game. I believe it was about February or March time, and I don't think Polyphony have any plans to go back and actually add an engine swap to this one. Hopefully they do, and hopefully it's a race variant so we can make the most of that incredible DTM body kit. So from cars that at least had a bit of potential to genuinely bad cars here, in at number 3, the Afeela prototype, which is basically a rolling advertisement for the Sony Honda Mobility program, and we of course knew this car was coming at some point this year, and unfortunately it's even more disappointing than it could have been. So let's begin. It's an EV car, it's incredibly heavy, it cannot be upgraded or changed, and Polyphony are literally giving it away for free, and that doesn't necessarily mean you should go ahead and get your hands on one. This is a genuinely bad car. However, it wasn't really about the performance for this car. In fact, a lot was shown off with the whole infotainment system of the vehicle, and I really thought it could be salvaged by being a very good VR car, but unfortunately a lot of the quirky features that were shown off with this thing in the real world have not been put in game. Unfortunately, that just leaves you with a very boring and bland car that almost looks like something that should be shipping people around to the airport in a taxi-like state. So unfortunately, with all its quirky infotainment and in-car features pretty much entirely absent, that means that the car is just very much a useless, boring paperweight of a vehicle that really doesn't necessarily deserve its place in game. And again, it's pretty much just a rolling advertisement. The only reason you may want to use this as it makes a very good base car for liveries. Apart from that, I just genuinely wouldn't bother. So let's move in to number 2 then, and we're going to stick with the EV theme for this one as we head over to the Skoda VGT. Now there's 2 very good reasons that this car makes the list, and I'll explain them more in detail. So let's begin then with number 1 is the fact that this is currently the only Skoda in game, and it doesn't look like we're going to get any others anytime soon. So really, Skoda's entry into Gran Turismo 7 was a Gran Turismo vision car, and it really isn't one that many people want to use. First and foremost, it's an EV which instantly docks it points. Really, the performance isn't bad from it, and I would say it is one of the cooler EV vehicles in game, and perhaps maybe one of the cooler VGTs in game, but unfortunately it's still not very desirable or very usable whatsoever. Number 2 has to be just how much Polyphony hyped this thing up. They did a whole special cringy event featuring this car, and it didn't necessarily go to plan, I don't think, and of course it did get leaked early, which didn't necessarily help that either. Another thing that really bothers me about the car is of course the heads-up display. It could have been a really cool feature, but it's completely static and doesn't necessarily refer to what you're actually doing on the track, so things like traction and brake bias and stuff. So again, you can kind of completely ignore that. That felt like a massive missed opportunity. In general though, the performance isn't that bad, but again, with this being the only Skoda in game and none looking to be released on the horizon, and again with Polyphony overhyping this thing like no tomorrow for it to turn out to be an EV and some Batmobile like looks, it really is a massive disappointment to see Skoda get entered and forgotten about so soon. So here we go then. Number 1, the Porsche Mission X. One of the more recent additions to Gran Turismo 7 is perhaps one of the most disappointing as well, and there's a good reason for that, because the Porsche Mission X is set to go ahead and replace the 918, which is perhaps one of the most much loved modern Porsches in modern times, and unfortunately, despite its incredible looks in game, it has turned out to be one of the most disappointing cars of the year. And it's not even this time because it's an electric vehicle. It does have these stats and performance to back it up, but unfortunately it's terrible to drive and has absolutely no use whatsoever. Of course, this car's hyped up to be in the kind of same lineup as the likes of the 918 Spider, and of course on top of that the Carrera GT prior to the 918, and unfortunately it's nowhere near as good as any of them. And of course we have the in-game problems as well. The first one is that this car is entirely useless, and I'm not kidding with that. In fact, out of all the events we have in game, it really struggles to find a place in any single one of them other than maybe the Hypercar Parade. I think worst of all as well is that it can't even run in its own cup, which is the Porsche Cup events in game, and again the only real place I've found any use out of it is in the Hypercar Parade. Everywhere else it either just runs out of battery or is completely useless or too powerful to enter. So at this point you may be thinking, well, I'll go ahead and make a custom race for it then. Well, unfortunately you're probably going to find out the hard way that this ends up being a one make car and cannot be ran with anything else other than itself. And it's the same when it comes to Sophie, it's not even eligible for that. The only real use this car has served in game was for a 2-week long time trial in which it was absolutely awful to use around the Red Bull Ring. And that's actually going to bring me to the point about the way this thing performs, and it's mainly due to the tyres and handling model of GT7 making the car almost undrivable. You put the power down too early, well, you can guarantee you're going to be pirouetting around. Again, you just want to try and get out the corner as fast as possible while everything else overtakes you. Well, you can guarantee it's going to spit you into the barrier. Really, this car performs absolutely awful when it comes to its handling. It really is a massive shame because admittedly this might just be one of the best looking EVs to ever be created, and I think it genuinely is a good looking Porsche. And of course, with this thing set to replace the 918 around next year and break a bunch of real world lap records, I genuinely don't think it will ever receive the love with the likes of the 918 Spider, and of course before that the Carrera GT, which is still spoken about today. So for me, this is the worst car to be released in Gran Turismo 7 in 2024, and there's only one thing for it. So there we go, that is my personal top 5 worst cars of the year for 2024. Again, this is my personal list. You'll probably disagree in a lot of senses, whether that's the honourable mentions or the actual top 5 itself. So feel free to put yours in the comment section down below. A massive thank you for watching this. If you did miss my top 10 cars of the year for 2024, feel free to go ahead and watch that now. I will have it linked in the description down below. Anyway, a massive thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.